Last year, a YouTuber known as Coyote released a documentary that made waves around the community. It was hyped up and received a lot of attention during its release. Inside the fandom, the documentary was praised for its efforts to help understand the community in an approachable way. In the outside world, reception was also praised by critics for its apparent detail and appeal. Today I want to take a crack and throw my review into the ring. Hello first from the web, my name is Scar, and this is a review of Coyote's The Fandom. Just a quick disclaimer, while I am going to try and make objective points about this, reviews are inherently subjective. This is also my first time ever reviewing this sort of medium, and my expertise here is really on the historical subject matter and any bias or inaccuracies that come from it. I'm also going to dive into how well I think the documentary executes on the original premise, and how it delivers its message. Finally, while I'm not going to go super in-depth as my knowledge as a photographer is still very novice, I'm going to talk about the artistic side of this project. Please note that everything I'm going to say is from my perspective, and the beautiful thing about art is that it means something different to each person that encounters it. This video is in no way trying to sway your opinion of Coyote or her work. With all of this said, let's get into what exactly the fandom is. On Coyote's website, the fandom is described as a documentary that tells the evolution of the fandom and the highs and lows of such journey. Described as, quote, "The fandom dives headfirst into the imaginative world of furries, the often misunderstood internet subculture of fans of the anthropomorphic arts. Using a bountiful collection of archival tapes and images, this documentary traces the evolution of the furry fandom from its roots in the 1970s to the expansive international community it has become today. Join a host of charming characters, in parentheses, including the grandparents of the fandom itself, on this heartwarming journey throughout the decades. Witness the many triumphs and challenges that shaped furry into the most unique fandom of all time." Coming from this, in the Wikipedia article, the documentary is focused on telling the history of the fandom from the beginning to today. It wants to be approachable to those both inside and outside the fandom who seek to understand it more. So what does that entail? Let's take a look. The fandom is a dense monster, trying to pack almost 30 years of information into a 90-minute package while also sprinkling in side stories and keeping the whole thing at a personal level is not very easy. What results is a documentary trying to cover a large variety without ever putting its foot down. A jack of all trades when it comes to introducing the fandom through the lens of history, but a master of none. The fandom tries to cover so many bases, including the full story of Conference and its founders, what it's like for the people who have careers in the fandom, personas, furry adaptation of the internet, LGBTQ's place in the fandom, and so much more. When it comes to people who are looking for a very thorough look into such matters, it's a diverse taste that doesn't quite satisfy. Fandom can be seen as a documentary of the fandom's history, but not really. It's a peek into the life at con staff and different kinds of artists, but not really. And finally, it's a documentary trying to explain why furries do what they do with all their weird concepts, but at the same time, not really. It never really commits to just one thing. Instead, it tries to dabble in so much, and given the premise, that's not exactly a bad thing. Starting with the history side of things, the fandom is completely organized into each decade. The idea is that they help show the passage of time and clarify the timeline. While it succeeds somewhat, it's dragged down by the muddled tangents that sometimes feel out of place chronologically. A recurring face throughout the documentary is Bubbles, the chairman of Denfur. Denfur is a convention that was created in 2019 after the collapse of Rocky Mountain FurCon. Bubbles is introduced 15 minutes into the documentary and begins her story before we've ever even established Conference, the first FurCon. Her story only continues to break the flow throughout the runtime. Contrast this to Uncle Kage and Lucky Coyote, who are both introduced at points in the timeline that make sense. Uncle Kage starts out as just an attendee of Conference, critiquing its atmosphere, and then goes on to become the chairman of Anthrocon. Lucky Coyote is a fursuit maker who was brought up towards the end of when fursuits were becoming much more commonplace. Concepts of furry are also handled well. Each is brought up and explained as they come up in history. From fanzines to personas, fursuits, and conventions are all merged seamlessly. This is one of the decisions that really did help the pacing. Although the fandom's history aspect is not without some minor falls. While what it does tell is accurate, there is a good number of things that were left out. It is nice hearing about the personal beginning of furry interest for Rod O'Reilly and how he met and fell in love with his mate, but it's baffling when the name Rarbrazzle isn't mentioned once. Rarbrazzle, for those unaware, was a fanzine that began after the fall of Voodoo, and is considered by many people, including Mark Millennium and Rod O'Reilly, to be when the fandom actually started. It's an important moment that goes completely unaddressed. You can really tell how pressed for time the documentary is, because some segments really feel rushed in terms of getting out information. But in trying to keep it slow and simple, a good amount of information can get glossed over. The documentary also spends the majority of its time talking about the early days and really shrinks its time budget as it gets closer to recent history. The time budget really runs out after the 2000s start. While it's nice to see the burn furs acknowledged and explained a little bit more than some other historical coverage has, they still feel undercooked and there is no mention of prior movements that preceded them. The story cuts off completely after the death of Conference, desperately trying to bridge into the modern fandom but falls on its face by skipping over an era of the fandom and fumbling with what little runtime remains. The ending feels very abrupt and out of place. The final word for the documentary is in the political landscape the fandom finds itself in, but fails to even talk about the World Wide Web's influence on the fandom. In fact, the only time the internet really gets mentioned at all is when they explain the rise of bulletin board systems and furry muck back in the 90s. The fandom also never strays too far from Conference or Anthrocon. Because of Bubbles, Denver gets mentioned, but the convention space doesn't get elaborated on much further. Not that there'd be much room for it, as I previously mentioned, this documentary has a bit of a bloat problem. Thankfully, the fandom does branch into different art forms, and reach some level of diversity by including fursuit makers, artists, and in the case of Kage, performers. It would have been nice seeing a bit more representation by maybe including a musician or an author, especially since Fox and Pepper scored the entire documentary. Overall, the history and scope of the fandom is narrowed dramatically by its ambition and restrictions of both the documentary format and its runtime. It provides a great, accurate first look into the furry history and the world of furries, but as a resource for anyone wanting to learn a comprehensive history of furries, it's best paired with other content. Bias is a part of journalism, and striving to make unbiased work is commendable but can also be extremely difficult, especially when dealing with a fandom that has an inherently large left bias. The fandom tries to be unbiased, which is more than can be said about personas, but it doesn't get very far. Before talking about political bias, there's the content bias with the fandom relying a lot on well-known figures. In the historical sense, this makes sense, as many of the gray muzzles are going to stand out in a fandom of younger adults by default. When it comes to the more recent times, the fandom reaches for more popular artists and fursuit makers who are more well-known. This does lead to a little bit of a lack of diversity, but nothing that hurts it too much. Bringing in even just a few smaller creatives, though, could have helped bring more perspective to the fandom. This extends into the crew, with it primarily being comprised of Ash, her husband, and the duo of Fox Seymour and Pepper Coyote, probably two of the most well-known musicians in the fandom. I do wonder if they had contacted a smaller musician, or even had tried to get someone like Cheetah to do a track. That being said, the benefits of having these two score the entire project are highlighted. I am proud of how they handled Conference and all the critiques of what happened during its middle life. They didn't try to paint the founders or Kage as the villain, which was a breath of fresh air after seeing how Fursonas treated Kage, and how other people have treated Conference. Moving into the political bias, as stated, the fandom attempts to avoid it but unfortunately fails. Furries are overall a left-leaning majority fandom, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It did clearly influence a little bit of the decision-making, but nothing that I thought caused issues. The only blatant moment where it becomes problematic in telling the story is at the very end, where fittingly enough it discusses how politicized the fandom has become. Whether the furries interviewed or the editing are the reason, there is much talk of the alt-right side of the fandom without bringing up the counterpart. Although a difficult metric to measure, furry does also have a far-left issue as well. People like To the Ranting Griffin have been effectively cancelled due, in part, to people misconstruing his statements. Even in my case, I was called a Nazi on Twitter recently just for being in a furry Raiders chat, despite only being there for research purposes. The facet of this fandom is never mentioned once or even alluded. It's strictly kept as an alt-right issue, which is only half of the truth. Whether bringing up the real political wars in the entirety is a good idea for this sort of project or not, it's better to bring the full truth or just omit it entirely. The pacing of the fandom is overall successful. For the most part, it flows events and concepts chronologically through the fandom's history, with only the odd occasional breakup. These breakups, such as the aforementioned Denver, do drag it down a little bit, as it disrupts the flow. At best, the documentary bounces back and forth between topics at a digestible and fairly treated rate. At worst, it feels like you're trying to count through a shuffled deck of cards. The performances are well done. Each interview feels authentic and driven, and they really help show the passion these people have for what they do in and for the fandom as a whole. The information presented both feels accessible and clear. Information is filtered and paced for the average viewer so it doesn't overwhelm them. The fandom opens and introduces people to furries by using the popular tactic of referring to old anthro media people probably have an emotional connection with, and then uses this to introduce the fundamental reasons of furries. The purpose of the entire documentary is to introduce people, both inside and outside of the fandom, to the origins and furries and its concepts. While it is likely to teach existing furries some new things about their history, it really succeeds at offering an understandable approach into the fandom. History is used as the lens to explain furries and teaches it effectively. Overall, the fandom succeeds in its goal. The only shame is the limitations it's faced with, which likely won't be noticed by the majority of viewers. It omits certain historical topics, nothing that leaves a large gap, but noteworthy things that people interested in history should know. One thing the fandom strives to do is give insight into the life of different people in the fandom. Fursuit makers, con staff, and artists are all give a unique perspective. I wish this was taken to the next level and included a few more appearances to really round out the creator side of the fandom. Imagine if an author or a YouTuber was included in the roster. I was genuinely surprised neither Fox Amor or Pepper Coyote showed up on camera to talk briefly about furry music, especially since there were both major selling points with their contributions to the project. Moving on to the artistic side of things, the fandom provides a solid vision from start to end with both its music and visuals. There isn't a whole lot of standouts, but that's not an insult. Cinematography did its job where applicable. There was the occasional shot that did leave an impression, but these were few and far between. The old footage that was scrounged up is probably the strongest point of the documentary, reinforcing the stories told of a long-lost time in fandom history. Occasionally, there was also little animations that filled gaps, which never struck me as anything super special, but they definitely did help fill the air. The editing was what you'd expect out of a documentary. The interviews are all used well enough, although that is a hard thing to judge without the full content of them. Two of furry's most notable figures, Fox Amor and Pepper Coyote, contributed their skills in order to create the original soundtrack and to accompany the fandom. The music on its own is amazing. I mean, it's Foxes and Peppers, that's par for the course. But when it comes to enhancing the experience, it can range from just filling the silence to enhancing the emotion of the documentary. The quality does vary a little throughout the video, but it never becomes distracting or feels out of place. Overall, the entire production felt like it had a large amount of passion and care put into it. The team behind this put an insane amount of effort into this, and I'm happy to see it getting the attention it deserves. It's a strong piece of furry media that helps explain who we are, our history, and is a great way to introduce people into the concepts it brings up. The fandom, despite its flaws, execute and for the most part succeeds in its goals. It's definitely worth the watch, and it's also excellent at giving a first understanding to people outside the fandom, and it's a resource worth sharing. Although limited in more recent history and some odd pacing, it's definitely worthy of some praise. Make sure to give this one a watch at the very least. The team did some really good work on this endeavor. But anyway guys, that's going to be it for this video. Please go check out Ash Coyote. Their content is amazing. I'm not personally the biggest fan of theirs, but that's mostly just because I don't watch a lot of furry YouTube, at least not as much as I used to. But definitely please go subscribe to them, give them a watch, and if you haven't seen this documentary, what are you waiting for? Go watch it. Until next time, guys, stay tuned.